Hi, I'm Ann Carrico from Annie and Everything, and today we're on part 3 of our series about how to get started with homeschooling high school. And I noticed something that I need to come clean about. I was planning on using this part 3, to talk about credits, but I've discovered I already have an episode of the podcast about credits. So that means I don't need to redo them here. I will link to that episode in the show notes, of course. But today we're going to talk instead about, okay, we'll talk a little bit about credits just to bring, just as a summary, but we'll also talk instead more about core courses and electives and how to fit them into your plan. So that's what we're doing instead today. Again, check out the show notes if you need an episode about credits that goes into more detail than what I do here today. First of all, a reminder, and that is that you do not need to follow your public school law when it comes to deciding how many credits or what those credits need to be in. Please revisit or go take them in now, part 1 and part 2 of this series. Part 1 tells you that the only thing you have to follow is your state homeschool law. Goes into a lot of detail about how to understand what that says. Part 2 goes into detail about how to check what college requirements are, because that's what you're working towards, and you don't need to worry at all about fulfilling public school, local high school requirements. What you want to look toward is the goal that your kid wants to meet, which is often college. So part 2 tells you how to go find college requirements and then work your way towards them during high school. The public school requirements are going to be overwhelming, intimidating, and they're so not necessary. And you don't need to feel like, oh, I need to use them as a guide just to be sure that I cover all the bases. You don't. You don't. You have the freedom to make sure you're following your state homeschool law and then choose to follow college requirements rather than your public school requirements, because then you also get the freedom to fill in around those college requirements with what you think is important for your kid. And we talked about that in part 2 as well. So moving right along, credits then are the units of study that your kid will do. Most colleges, for instance, request 4 credits of English or language arts. So then what is a credit made up of? In general, a credit is considered to be at least about 160 hours of a core course during the course of a year. So that works out in general to about 1 hour a day in that particular core course for the entire year. So if you're trying to fit in 1 credit of English for the year, then you're going to find a course that says it's worth 1 credit, or you're going to make sure your kid is working on English for about an hour a day for the year. That's not an and equation, that's an or equation. If you found a curriculum that says it's worth a credit, then it doesn't really matter how much time your kid is working on it. Once they get it done, they earn that credit. But if you are instead pulling together resources for your kid to comprise that language arts credit, then you just want to make sure you've pulled enough together that they are approximately equal to an hour of work a day over the course of the year. And more detail about that again in the episode about credits, which I will link to in the show notes. Okay, so let's move on then to core courses and electives, because they are also a vital part of putting together a plan for your kid. And also just another reminder to get it out of the way right now, all of this can be found in my book, Cure the Fear of Homeschooling High School, if you want something all in one spot that's written down that gives you forms to fill out each step of the way. So back to core courses and electives. Okay, so let's chat about core courses first. And because I used to be a math teacher, I tend to start with math. So in general, Algebra 1 is considered to be the first high school level math course. That doesn't mean that your kid can't take pre-algebra in high school and you count it for high school. It just means that colleges might not accept it as a high school level course when they're looking at how many credits of math your kid has completed. So that is something you're going to want to keep in mind. Algebra 1, and then you have a choice whether to do geometry next or algebra 2 next. And then after that, you do whichever one you didn't do second, right? So either algebra 1 geometry, algebra 2, or Algebra 1, Algebra 2, Geometry. Now, I, as the former math teacher, do tend to do geometry in the middle, and there's a couple reasons for that. One of them is that geometry only requires an Algebra 1 level of understanding. So it's a great way to give your kid a change of pace if they were feeling not so happy with algebra, but it also then kind of reviews that Algebra 1 for them a little bit as they're going through geometry. It is a completely different type of math course, so it's not like if they didn't do well in Algebra 1 that they're not going to be able to do well in geometry. So it will review just a little bit in there, but it is completely different. There's no Algebra 2 in geometry. So if you've done Algebra 2 first, then your kid is basically just dropping Algebra 2 altogether to do geometry. And here's the thing, when they're getting ready to take ACT and SAT tests, that's right about around junior year. So that's when they want to have that Algebra 2 fresh in their minds, which is generally when they'll take it if they've done geometry second. So that's why I recommend Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2 for those reasons, not the least of which is they're working with Algebra 2 right when they're ready to take those ACT and SAT exams, and that means it's fresh in their brain, so they're going to do a better job. That's just my take on it. There are plenty of people who say to do Algebra 2 second, and you can go find out what they have to say about it as well. Most colleges do not require 4 credits of math, but what would come after Algebra 2 would be pre-calculus. So that's the progression there. Science. So people differ as to whether physical science is considered a high school credit. I put it on all of my kids' transcripts and never had a problem with it. So I think it would be considered a high school credit. After that, you can do biology, chemistry, generally in that order, and here's why. Chemistry has some math, and it's got quite a bit of math, to be honest with you. So you want your kid to have a couple of high school level math courses under their belt, or at least algebra by the time they take chemistry. So that's why people generally take biology first, because it doesn't have the math that chemistry does. Then after chemistry, you could try some physics if your kid wants more science. Again, most colleges don't require 4 credits of science. So I guess, though, if you go through physics, then you don't have to worry about whether physical science is a high school course or not, because by then, if they've taken physical science, biology, chemistry, and then physics, which is different than physical science. Physics is more about electricity, sound, waves, motion, work. Physical science is more about the earth, weather, geology, totally different disciplines there. If they've taken the physics, then that's 3 credits of science, biology, chemistry, physics. And again, physics would come after chemistry because more math, right? So your kid needs to be a math fan if you want to progress to even higher levels of science. So my point was, getting back around to that if they've taken physics then, and the college they're applying to only requires 3 credits of science, then whether or not physical science is a high school credit becomes a moot point. So that's something to consider, but it definitely depends on your kid. Only one of my kids took physics, and it was, we didn't like it at all. I would definitely use a different curriculum than the one we picked, no doubt about it. Now, another thing about science is I've mentioned to you the most common courses, but colleges aren't actually usually picky about which course your kid takes. So if you want to throw astronomy in there, or meteorology, or some other science instead, maybe anatomy and physiology, if you want to have them, instead of moving on to physics, maybe they want to move on to marine biology or something instead, all of those are fine as science credits. You don't have to stick with the normal progression if the college isn't specifying. Some colleges do, but most do not. So nothing to worry about there. Okay, so then let's move on to history. History, you have a lot more freedom about what you can study. Some colleges may say, oh, we want you to have some American history in there. Some colleges may say economics is a must. Some colleges may say civics is a must. A lot of colleges don't even specify that much. So it is going to depend, again, about your college research that you've done. If you're still having questions about that, go back to part 2 of this series. But you can put anything else you want in there. So world history, you can choose to do a history of a particular country or focus on history of a given time period, maybe World War II history. A lot of great resources out there for all sorts of different types of history, and you have the option to do whatever you think is important for your kid. Ancient history is another one that people like to do, or they like to go through the cycle of starting with ancient and then, what's the next era there, and then more modern history. Any of that is totally fine. Language arts is a little bit different than all the others in that there is so much freedom with what you can do there, and a lot of people have questions about what actually constitutes a language arts credit. And let me just say, first of all, that whenever I'm talking about language arts, I'm talking about English, not foreign language, but English. So I will use those two terms interchangeably, and you can too. Language arts, or English, is comprised of any of these things. Could be grammar, could be speech, could be writing, could be vocabulary, could be literature. Golly, am I missing anything? Off the top of my head, those are the main areas that people will lump into language arts. And notice I said it could be any of those things. It does not have to be all of those things all the time. So for instance, if you want your 9th grader to keep concentrating on grammar, that can be their English credit. If your senior is done with grammar and has had enough writing and you just want them to focus on literature, that can be their English credit. You do not have to include all of those areas all the time. You do not have to make your kid take a vocabulary book and work in that and set that aside, and then take a writing book and work in that and set that aside every single day. Your kid can focus on one thing at a time, or if you want to, you can add a few things in at a time. Just don't have them working on English more than approximately an hour a day if you are only working on one credit. Now, if you are trying to do 2 credits of English at a given time, then fine. Then they would be working approximately 2 hours a day, and then maybe they're picking and choosing from all of these things every day. But in general, don't feel like you have to make your kid do all those things every time. I did write a blog post about that, and I will link to that in the show notes as well, because that's a very common misunderstanding, and it's absolutely not necessary. So when it comes to English, you can pretty much run the gamut about whatever you think it is important for your kid to know. Writing does not have to be a thing through all 4 years. My kids didn't actually start focusing on writing until junior and senior year. To tell you what I did, we focused on grammar for 9th and 10th grade still. And I'll be honest and say that my kids did score, all of them have scored quite high on the English component of the standardized tests, and I think it was because we kept working on grammar even in high school. Then my kids moved to writing and literature for junior year and senior year, and that's how I moved them through. Did not do it all, didn't even focus on vocabulary ever. I didn't have them study vocabulary ever because I did also allow them a lot of free reading time, and so that's where we worked on vocabularies, just through the context of reading. That's what I did. And on the transcript, the courses were just called, for those grammar portions, I just called it English 9 and English 10. And then I got more specific junior and senior years and would call, then we moved into actually semester long courses. So that's another thing, is you don't have to do a full year course. You can do 2 half-year courses. That comprises a full credit if you do a half credit of one thing in the fall and a half credit of something else in the spring. So then junior and senior year, I named the courses specific things. So it might have been Shakespeare tragedies for a semester, or writing an essay for a semester. But you can use English 9, English 10, English 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you're pulling a bunch of things together for your kid, you can use whatever you want to on the transcript. Colleges are just looking for those 4 credits. They're not super concerned about how they happen. I also like to call foreign language a core course. That's just me. Some people will call it an elective. The thing is, though, that some colleges will specify that a foreign language is necessary, and they might specify that it needs to be 2 credits in the same foreign language. So you can't take French 1 and then Spanish 1. You have to decide, are you going to do French 1 and 2 or Spanish 1 and 2 or German 1 and 2 or whatever. So I highly recommend that you include foreign language in your kids' plan and that you pick one that they're going to be able to study for 2 years. So that's core courses. Pretty simple, and they are definitely going to be the bulk of what your kid does each day. Again, when you look at those college requirements, you'll see that they don't need to do all core courses every year. So there might be a year that you skip history or another year that you skip science. I do recommend doing math all in a row and then maybe skipping it senior year because it's just helpful to have it all fresh in their head as they move through. So I would not suggest skipping sophomore or junior year of math, just because then when they come back into it, they're like, what am I doing again? Right? I want to move on to electives, and there's actually not a whole lot to know about electives, but first I want to mention a resource that's going to be super helpful for you as you are looking for electives to put on your kids' schedule, and that is Music in Our Homeschool, who has sponsored this episode. Music in Our Homeschool offers 5 high school level courses, which will give your kid elective credit, yes, but also fine arts credit, which might be something that you're looking to find because some colleges do specify that they want a certain amount of fine arts credits. Music in Our Homeschool has music appreciation courses that are online courses that are worth either a half credit or a whole credit, depending upon which course you're looking at. They provide everything that is necessary for your kid to get some fine arts credit, but also be learning about music. And actually, one of the courses talks about art and poetry as well. These courses are built for you. They provide everything that you need. Your kid is learning about music as part of their school day, and you don't have to lift a finger to make it happen. And they are very reasonably priced. And exciting new news is that Music in Our Homeschool has just opened a fine arts membership for high schoolers so that you can pay a monthly subscription fee and have access to everything high school that Music in Our Homeschool offers whenever you need it. That is a really flexible option as well. So I'm going to put a link in the show notes to Music in Our Homeschool so you can go take a look at what they have to offer. Electives are fun, and they are something that colleges don't specify, so you can build in electives however you like. And you can find curriculum for electives, or you can build your own electives. Here's my main tip about electives, though, and that is that you don't specify which ones they're going to be until right before the semester that they're going to be taken, because then you can work off of your kids' interests. So we're coming into fall semester now. So now is when you would pick electives for fall semester, and then maybe December or early January, you would pick which electives to do for the spring, because your kids' interests are going to change drastically. And I suggest you build electives around their interests. So from semester to semester, they're going to change drastically. So don't ask them at the end of 8th grade, okay, what do you want to do for electives for all 4 years? No. And that's really the only thing to know about electives. And again, just to keep in mind that if it's something that you've put together, for instance, driver's education is a great elective, but that's going to involve mostly just time behind the wheel. So just make sure that you have enough time behind the wheel to account for a half credit. So for electives, I always recommend about 60 hours for a half credit. Make sure that if their driver's ed is not taking 60 hours behind the wheel, that you've got some other things going on so that you can legitimately call it a half credit. Electives are fun. They break up the day. I highly recommend that you have some of them. But remember, too, that you don't need to have a gazillion credits. Remember that each credit you assign is going to be approximately an hour worth of work each day. So my recommendation is don't do more than 7 credits in any given year, and that 7 would actually be an exceptional year, not every year. Colleges are not looking for a specific number of transcripts on the credit, and in this case, more is definitely not better. For us ordinary folks with ordinary kids who are applying to ordinary colleges, the number of credits on the transcript is not a factor that colleges look at, as long as you've got a reasonable number that reflects a reasonable high school education. Part 2 goes into detail about speech, writing, grammar. Why can't I think of any right now? Literature.